Imagine casually telling someone exactly how you are going to die, not because a doctor gave you a diagnosis, not because you were facing an obvious danger. You simply describe the place, the age, or the circumstances of your own death. Then, years later, it happens. Throughout history, people have made strange statements about their final moments. Most were probably jokes, fears, or coincidences that only became meaningful afterward. But a few were so specific that they are difficult to ignore. One man calculated the exact date of his death using mathematics. A famous athlete named both his age and his cause of death. And a writer believed his life was connected to an object that only returned once every 75 years. These are 7 people who appeared to predict their own deaths. Number 7. W.T. Stead. William Thomas Stead was one of the most influential journalists in Britain during the late 19th century. He investigated corruption, campaigned for social reform, and helped develop a more dramatic style of journalism that would later become common around the world. But Stead was also fascinated by disasters, spiritualism, and life after death. In 1886, he published a fictional story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor. The story described a passenger ship colliding with another vessel in the Atlantic Ocean. Because there were not enough lifeboats, many of the passengers died. Stead did not present it as a supernatural prediction, he wrote it as a warning. At the end of the story, he argued that this was exactly what could happen if companies continued sending large passenger ships to sea without enough lifeboats for everyone on board. 6 years later, Stead published another story involving a ship encountering an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Then, in April 1912, he boarded the Titanic. The Titanic was one of the largest passenger ships ever built, yet it carried lifeboat space for only a fraction of the people on board. On the night of April 14, the ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Just like the dangers Stead had described years earlier, there were not enough lifeboats for every passenger and crew member. Witness accounts of Stead's final moments differ. Some stories claim that he helped women and children reach the boats. Other details were added years later and may not be reliable. What is certain is that Stead never escaped the ship. He died in the exact kind of maritime disaster he had warned about 26 years earlier. This was probably not a paranormal vision. Stead understood that passenger ships were carrying too few lifeboats, and he used fiction to expose a real danger. But that explanation does not make the ending any less unsettling. The warning he wrote for everyone else eventually became the story of his own death. Number 6. Abraham de Moivre. Abraham de Moivre was a French mathematician who spent much of his life in England. His work influenced probability, statistics, and the mathematics used to understand random events. But according to one famous story, his final calculation was not about cards, gambling, or probability. It was about himself. Late in his life, de Moivre reportedly noticed that he was sleeping approximately 15 minutes longer every night. Instead of ignoring it as a normal part of growing older, he treated the pattern like a mathematical problem. If the amount of sleep continued increasing by 15 minutes each day, he calculated that eventually he would reach a day when he slept for a full 24 hours. De Moivre supposedly decided that this would be the day he died. That date was November 27, 1754. According to the story, his calculation was correct. He died on November 27th. It sounds almost too perfect, and that may be because parts of the story were exaggerated after his death. De Moivre really did die on that date, but historians have questioned whether he genuinely calculated it in advance, exactly as the legend describes. The story became popular because it matched his identity so well. A mathematician spends his life studying probability and then uses a simple pattern to calculate the end of his own life. There is also a less supernatural explanation. Sleeping for longer periods can indicate that someone's health is declining. De Moivre was 87 years old. He may have recognized that his body was slowly shutting down and turned that observation into a calculation. Even if the story was partly improved over time, its central image has survived for centuries. An aging mathematician watches the minutes of sleep increase, writes down a final date, and waits to discover whether the equation is correct. Number 5. Frank Pastore. Frank Pastore began his career as a professional baseball player. After retiring from the sport, He became a Christian radio host in California, where he regularly discussed faith, morality, and what he believed happened after death. On November 19, 2012, Pastore was speaking live on his radio program. During the discussion, he explained that nobody could know exactly how much time they had left. He then gave an example involving himself. Pastore rode a motorcycle on a busy California freeway. He said that at any moment, a car could cross into his lane and he could be killed. It was not presented as a psychic prediction. He was using his daily motorcycle journey to explain how quickly and unexpectedly a person's life could end. A few hours after the broadcast, Pastore was riding his motorcycle on the 210 freeway. A car entered his path. The collision left him with severe injuries, and he was taken to a hospital. Pastore remained in a coma for almost a month. On December 17th, he died at the age of 55. When listeners returned to the earlier broadcast, the example suddenly sounded completely different. On the same day as the crash, Pastore had described almost the exact kind of accident that would take his life. Of course, he knew that riding a motorcycle carried risks. He regularly traveled on crowded freeways, so the scenario was not impossible to imagine. But the timing is what makes the story disturbing. He did not make the statement years before the accident. He made it only hours earlier. A hypothetical warning about how suddenly life can end became a description of what was already waiting for him later that day. Number 4. Arnold Schoenberg. Arnold Schoenberg was an Austrian composer who transformed modern classical music. He was intelligent, innovative, and willing to challenge traditions that had existed for centuries. But he was also deeply afraid of one number, 13. Schoenberg suffered from triskaidekaphobia, the fear of the number 13. He was born on September 13th, and throughout his life he became increasingly convinced that the number would somehow be connected to his death. He worried about years associated with 13. He avoided certain numbers in his work. Even the spelling of titles could make him uncomfortable if the number of letters seemed dangerous. When Schoenberg reached the age of 76, an astrologer sent him a warning. 7 plus 6 equals 13. The message convinced him that his 76th year might be his last. Then came Friday, July 13, 1951. Schoenberg spent the day in bed, terrified that something was going to happen. His wife later described him as anxious, depressed, and extremely unwell. As the hours passed, she began hoping that midnight would arrive and prove his fear wrong. At approximately 11:45 that night, only 15 minutes before the date ended, Schoenberg died. The official explanation was not a supernatural force connected to the number 13. He was elderly and suffering from health problems. Some people have suggested that his extreme fear and stress may have placed additional pressure on his body. In other words, Schoenberg may not have predicted his death. His belief in the prediction may have helped create the conditions surrounding it. That possibility is arguably even more disturbing. For years, he feared that 13 would be waiting for him at the end. And when the final Friday the 13th of his life arrived, he spent the entire day expecting death. Just before midnight it came. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe. Because whether these stories involve coincidence, instinct, or something we do not understand, the next 3 predictions become almost impossible to ignore. Number 3. Mikey Welsh. Mikey Welsh was a musician and artist best known for playing bass with the rock band Weezer. After leaving the band, he focused more heavily on painting, but he remained connected to fans through social media. On September 26, 2011, Welsh posted a disturbing message on Twitter. He said that he had dreamed he would die in Chicago the following weekend from a heart attack in his sleep. He added that he needed to write his will. Then he corrected himself. He said the dream had actually predicted the weekend after next. To anyone reading at the time, it could have looked like dark humor. People regularly post strange dreams online, and almost all of them are forgotten within minutes. But approximately 2 weeks later, Welsh traveled to Chicago. He planned to attend a Weezer performance and check out of his hotel on October 8th. When he failed to leave his room, hotel employees went inside. Welsh was found unresponsive and could not be revived. He was 40 years old. Reports indicated that drugs were found in the room, and his death was believed to be connected to an overdose. That means the details did not perfectly match the dream's description of a natural heart attack during sleep. But the location and timing were extremely close. He had written that he would die in Chicago during a specific weekend. Then he died in Chicago during that weekend. There is no proof that Welsh had supernatural knowledge. He may have known more about his physical condition or personal risks than the public did. The tweet could have been a joke, a coincidence, or an expression of something he was already struggling with. But because the message was posted publicly before his death, it could not simply be invented afterward. The words were already there. The location was there. The corrected weekend was there. And less than 2 weeks later, the dream became reality. Number 2. Pete Maravich. Pete Maravich was one of the most talented basketball players of his generation. Nicknamed Pistol Pete, he became famous for his incredible scoring, creative passes, and a style of play that seemed years ahead of everyone around him. In 1974, when Maravich was 26, he gave an interview to the Beaver County Times. During that interview, he made a strangely specific statement about his future. He said that he did not want to play 10 years in the NBA and then die of a heart attack at the age of 40. At the time, there was no obvious reason to treat the statement as a prediction. Maravich was young, active, and competing at the highest level of professional basketball. He eventually completed exactly 10 seasons in the NBA. In 1980, injuries forced him to retire. 8 years later, on January 5, 1988, Maravich joined a casual pickup basketball game inside a church gym in California. He appeared healthy. According to people who were there, he had been talking and playing normally. Then, without warning, he collapsed. Pete Maravich died from heart failure. He was 40 years old. An examination discovered that Maravich had been born without one of the major coronary arteries normally supplying blood to the heart. His remaining artery had become enlarged to compensate, allowing him to survive years of intense physical activity without knowing how vulnerable he was. The coincidence was almost exact. He played 10 seasons in the NBA. He died from a heart condition. And he was 40 years old. The statement from 1974 was phrased as something he did not want to happen, not something he claimed definitely would happen. But when all three details eventually matched, it became one of the most chilling quotes in sports history. Maravich could not have known about the missing artery. Medical examinations throughout his career had never discovered it. Yet 14 years before his death, he described the length of his career, his cause of death, and his final age in a single sentence. Number 1. Mark Twain. At number 1 is one of the most famous writers in American history. Mark Twain was born Samuel Clemens on November 30th, 1835. Only weeks earlier, Halley's Comet had reached the closest point of its journey around the Sun. The comet follows a long orbit and becomes visible from Earth approximately once every 75 or 76 years. That meant Twain understood something unusual about his life. If he survived into old age, the comet that appeared around his birth would return near the end of it. In 1909, when Twain was 73, he spoke about that connection. He said that he had arrived with Halley's Comet in 1835, that it was returning the following year, and that he expected to leave with it. He joked that it would be the greatest disappointment of his life if he did not. Twain even imagined that the two of them were connected. They had arrived together, so they had to leave together. This was exactly the kind of statement people expected from Mark Twain. He was famous for his humor and understood the power of a memorable line. But unlike a vague prediction, this one had a clear deadline. Halley's Comet was returning in 1910. On April 20th, 1910, the comet reached perihelion, the closest point of its orbit to the Sun. One day later, on April 21st, Mark Twain died from a heart attack. He was 74 years old. The comet would become more visible from Earth in the weeks that followed, so the idea that Twain died at the exact moment it passed our planet is an exaggeration. But the central prediction was still remarkably accurate. He said he would leave when the comet returned. The comet returned in 1910, and during its appearance, Twain died. There was nothing supernatural about knowing the comet's schedule. Astronomers had already calculated when it would return, and Twain was an elderly man whose health had declined. Still, he could not control the precise date of his death. He connected his life to an object traveling through space, waited more than 7 decades for it to return, and died only 1 day after it reached perihelion. Of all the stories on this list, Twain's feels less like a frightening accident and more like the final sentence of a perfectly written story. He entered the world with the comet, and just as he predicted, he left when it came back. These 7 stories do not prove that people can see the future. Some of the predictions were warnings about obvious dangers. Others were jokes, personal fears, dreams, or statements that became important only after the person died. And some details may have grown more dramatic as the stories were repeated. But coincidence does not always feel ordinary. Pete Maravich named his career length, his age, and his cause of death. Mikey Welsh posted the location and weekend of his death online before it happened. Mark Twain connected his life to a comet and lived just long enough to watch it return. Maybe these people simply understood their own risks better than anyone realized. Maybe the human mind notices small signs that never reach our conscious thoughts. Or maybe, out of the countless predictions people make every day, we only remember the few that come true. Whatever the explanation, each story leaves behind the same uncomfortable question. If you somehow knew how your life would end, would you want to know when? Which prediction shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like and subscribe for more entertaining videos about strange history, bizarre science, psychology, mysteries, and unbelievable true stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.